Bueno, mila esker guztioi.
Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much. This is a round table that has to do with the Happy Together exhibition. We're really happy with the entire process, to be honest. When we came up with the idea of the award, and we were collaborating with rêve, they've been with us every step of the way. And now we have our exhibition. Now the exhibition will travel to Bordeaux later on. And the idea is to publish a beautiful catalogue at the end of it. So I was just saying in Basque, I'm now going to repeat what I've just said in Spanish. So thank you all very much for coming. And yesterday, when we had our press conference, we did say that for us at the Institute, it's a source of pride. It's a source of enormous pride to be able, or to have generated and come up with this idea of coming up with an award for collective housing. I know there are a lot of architecture awards, and I know that it's difficult to carve your niche, but our idea was to come up with an award for collective housing, and we think that's very important. We want to serve as an observatory, or as a place from which we can try to push towards high quality architecture in the field of collective housing. And here the collaboration of the rêve Architectural Centre in Bordeaux was absolutely vital, and the advisory committee also, who was here right from the very beginning. Here we have two representatives of there. We have Bernard Blanc and we have Aurora Fernández Per as well with us, two members of that committee. And in fact, without them, we wouldn't have been able to design all the different guidelines, the principal guidelines, and there are so many different details that I could mention. The website, the deadlines, the different categories. I mean, there was so much to do. There was so much work. And hopefully this work will continue over time. Now, it's not just because the regional minister's here, but I would also like to thank our main source of support and funding, because none of this would have been possible without the support of the Basque government. So, without further ado, let me introduce our panel members. And after that, when we hear them, we can go upstairs and have a look at the exhibition. I think it looks great, to be honest. So I think there might be something else there as well. And we can have a nice chat afterwards. But let me start with the director of Arquitectura. We also have Bernard Blanc. We also have Ernest Garriga. We have Aurora Fernández Per and Pietro Ambrosini. And of course we have Fabrizio, who I mentioned before is the director of Arquitectura. So thank you very much. This is just another step on something that started in Bordeaux. I think we started in January 2023, and in a very short space of time we came up with this initiative, which isn't just another award, because there's a lot of awards in Europe. I also believe it's an instrument for a sort of an excuse to think about something that's very important and we need to think about. So the award aims to be a way of stimulating debate so that we can talk in more depth about different issues that have to do with all of this. And then we also have a publication, and hopefully this will continue into the future. Now, this is the result of the confluence of a lot of political and ideological ideas and people who have the same ideas. We have a confluence of the Institute, the regional ministry at the Basque Country for housing and the urban agenda. We have other experts here, members of the advisory committee, who have also been thinking with us about what the award should be like, what the categories should be like, how are we going to try to call out and reach out to all architects and also developers and citizens, because we all belong to the Council of Europe, which is actually a very large organization, and they have accompanied us with a lot of enthusiasm, and we were able to move forward thanks to them. You can see up in the exhibition we have some finalists for the new construction category. We have a representative of Col from Barcelona here with us on the panel. And we also have two projects for projects that aim to transform existing buildings. I think there's one in Zurich, one in Barcelona. I can't remember. I always get confused, but you'll see them upstairs. And there was the transformation of an old wine store. And there was another building in Sheffield as well that was renovated. So we had people entering from 19 different countries. And the idea is to just continue with the debate. We've had a very fluid debate so far. It's going to be a very fluid debate today. We don't have very strict deadlines. So I just think we're just going to see where the conversation takes us and just make the most of the fact that communication has been incredibly fluid until now. I've got some questions, but our panelists don't know what they're going to be, so they haven't been able to prepare their answers, so we want it to be as spontaneous as possible. So, we have Bernard Blanc with us. He's been working in Bordeaux for many, many years, working specifically in the field of social housing. And he was a person responsible for the renovation of the building Les Grands Pas. And then we have Aurora, who's very realistic. She's always been very consistent in everything that she does. And she's been working all over Europe. Now, and we also have our Italian friend, and as a fellow Italian, I recognize his talent and the fact that he's always searching for balance. So perhaps we can start with Bernard, for example. So why did you accept the invitation to become a part of the advisory committee? Oh, I was going to start with Aurora because she's the only woman, so maybe I could start with her if I'm just being a gentleman. We like to work with people with whom we like to spend time. And this is what we've done here. We like to work with people who are interesting and who we feel have a lot to offer. So, what is it that you found interesting about all of these different proposals? What was it that captivated you? Now, asking me to think and talk about housing is the best thing you could ever ask me to do. Much more than any other kind of proposal that's kind of more galactic or extravagant. because housing isn't glamorous, but it's essential. And when I received the invitation, I didn't have the slightest doubt. Obviously, it will depend on the different conditions that we were going to do. But if we were going to explore this issue in depth, then I definitely wanted to be there. And it's important to recognize housing, because in Europe, well, one of the hallmarks of Europe, collective housing, I believe is one of the hallmarks of Europe, the fact that we all live together. And that was my emotional response to all of this. Now, Aurora, you work in a magazine, so you have a privileged position, really. You can see, you get a very good idea of what's happening and what's going on, because you hear about a lot of proposals. So when you became a member of the advisory committee, what was your assessment of the state of Europe, of the situation in Europe? Is it a healthy situation? Is there a lot of work left to be done? You helped us to develop the structural concept of the awards. You helped us alongside many other very wise people. But what situation are we in? Are we doing okay? Are we doing terribly? From your position, and from your privileged position and as an observer, how are we doing in Europe? In Europe, there was a golden age of collective housing or affordable housing, which was at the end of the 90s and the beginning of the new millennium. Then we had some new protocols about how we could design collective housing. And that lasted up until the financial crisis. This is how I see it, at least. From 2010 onwards, there was hardly any architects working in the field of housing. There was no money, basically. And there was no money, especially for affordable housing. Everything that had been built, we thought there was so much of it, but in fact there wasn't that much of it. But with regard to quality, well, everything stopped because there was no production. And from 2015, 2016 onwards, there were some more projects started to emerge, and a new group of architects have emerged over recent years, and they are absolutely fantastic. I think that what we're seeing, and I think that in Spain as well, I think Spain is actually at the forefront of this movement alongside France, which had really, fallen into oblivion and then started to build collective housing. They started in the beginning of the 21st century, and now it's become a real hub for a shining example of what high-quality public collective housing should be. Spain, over recent years, has come up with some fantastic, valuable projects, and we have some examples of that here. And I think that what we're seeing in Europe is that there's a deep-rooted awareness, really, of the importance of collective housing, and that collective housing can be desirable. And this is what it has. This is what I've always said. It needs to be desirable. I think it is increasingly desirable. So I'm going to ask a question in Spanish, and then I'm going to translate it into French for Bernard. Now, my question is, now, you've been working for a long side on the side of the people who produce housing. I'd like to know what the different basic principles are that we should be defending.
Effectivement, de participer à cette initiative, et vu que tu as tellement travaillé du côté de la production, de l'espace, de la production du collectif, quels selon toi doivent être quelques axes, quelques orientations majeures, que le prix a essayé d'amener, mais sur lesquels il ne faut pas lâcher. Y necesitan traducción del francés al español?
Do you need translation from French to Spanish, or do you understand French perfectly? You understand French perfectly, right?
Avec Fabricio, ça se passait à San Sébastien. C'est que c'était ici, Et c'était vraiment extrêmement intéressant de pouvoir faire quelque chose avec ce Pays basque espagnol. Donc ça, c'était la dimension transfrontalière du prix. Arrêter d'avoir cet enfermement. Et à Bordeaux, on est très bordeluche, hein, comme on dit, Bordeaux, quoi, on s'enferme là. Et là, d'un seul coup, il y avait une ouverture. Autrement, on a quand même eu à gérer un léger paradoxe avec ce premier prix. C'est-à-dire que quand on a discuté de savoir qui allait présider le jury, le nom d'Anne Lacaton ou de Jean-Philippe Vassal est venu tout de suite du fait de leur notoriété, du prix qu'ils venaient de recevoir récemment. Et c'était une caution indiscutable pour décerner un prix sur le logement collectif. Or, on sait que Anne et Jean-Philippe, à Bordeaux, ils ont commencé leur première réalisation, c'est une maison. C'est la maison La Tapie, à Floirac. Et donc, comme beaucoup d'architectes, ils démarrent en faisant une unité d'habitation avec un jardin autour. Je veux dire, quand même, c'est un sacré pied de nez que d'embarquer ces deux architectes-là, et Anne en particulier, 40 ans plus tard, pour ne parler que du collectif. Et je me rappelle, quand on avait commencé le projet du GHI, où c'est 530 logements sur des barres de 17 étages, dans une grande cité HLM, Anne disait, on va faire 530 fois sur une des barres, 530 fois la maison La Tapie. Et en fait, on se dit, mais qu'est-ce que ça veut dire de travailler sur du logement collectif qu'on veut remettre à niveau? Moi, j'utilisais le terme de régénérer ces bâtiments, puisque je ne voulais pas les démolir. Et qu'est-ce que ça veut dire de dire que chaque logement va devenir une maison individuelle dans un immeuble collectif qui a marqué toutes les années 60, toute la reconstruction, où on ne parlait que de collectif. Et en fait, moi, j'ai compris avec eux, après, moi qui ne produisais et ne gérais que du logement collectif, quasiment, pendant 35 ans, j'ai compris, et en visitant aussi les habitants de la tour Bois-le-Prêtre à Paris, qui est le premier exemplaire avant le GHI, que, en fait, ce qu'on a à régler en collectif, c'est le rapport avec l'extérieur. Ce qu'on n'a absolument pas géré dans les années 60. On n'a pas du tout appréhendé la question de la relation de l'habitant avec son environnement immédiat. Pour preuve, c'est que nous, au GHI, mais comme dans toute la production du logement social en France à partir des années 60, les balcons font à peine 3 mètres carrés. C'est-à-dire qu'on n'a pas imaginé 2 secondes que des gens, des familles, qui allaient vivre en collectif, aspiraient à vivre à l'extérieur. Et ce qu'on a fait à la tour Bois-le-Prêtre, ce qu'ils ont fait, après ce qu'on a fait à Saint-Nazaire sur d'autres opérations avec eux, et ensuite au GHI, c'est de dire, ben dans le fond, je peux être dans l'habitat collectif, comme dans une maison individuelle qui a sa relation à son jardin, mais là, c'est encore mieux, parce qu'à Bordeaux, quand je suis au GHI, à partir du 4e étage, je domine toute la ville. Et moi, je me rappellerai juste pour conclure toujours qu'une parole d'un des habitants de la tour Bois-le-Prêtre, au dernier étage, qui était originaire d'une île, et tous les étés, il partait avec sa famille dans son île pour retrouver l'air, le vent, le soleil, etc., ce qu'il n'avait pas au bord du périph' à Paris. Et il dit, là maintenant, dans les conditions dans lesquelles j'habite, je vais rester tout l'été pour connaître les 4 saisons de l'habité. Et je pense que c'est ça qu'on a réglé sur la question du collectif qui est passionnant, c'est comment je permets à des gens dans des cellules, dans des cages à lapins, comme on disait à l'époque, de vivre en relation avec l'air, le vent. Moi, j'ai une personne âgée qui a vécu 40 ans dans son même logement au GHI, qui me dit « Ah, Monsieur Blanc, vous savez, maintenant, je suis très heureuse, sur ma terrasse, je me récupère les embruns. Quand il pleut, je suis mouillé, alors que je suis chez moi. » Et je trouve ça extraordinaire. Et c'est pour ça que ça m'intéressait qu'on se repose la question, mais dans le fond, qu'est-ce qu'on va apporter en travaillant sur le collectif? Qu'est-ce qu'on règle au plan humain, anthropologique? C'est quoi la question que nous pose ces gens qui habitent en collectif. En individuel, c'est réglé. Je suis chez moi, j'ai ma pelouse, j'ai mon chien, j'ai ma poule, si je veux, et je suis chez moi, c'est réglé. Mais en collectif, à part l'ascenseur, la cage d'escalier, l'entrée commune, je règle quoi dans la relation avec le reste du monde? Juste pour conclure, un des habitants du GHI, quand ils dominaient avec... Enfin, ils ont des terrasses qui font la surface de leur ancien logement. Ça peut aller jusqu'à 60 mètres carrés. Hein. Il regarde la ville de Bordeaux qu'il domine du 13e étage complètement. Et puis, il a cette parole merveilleuse. Il dit, mais dans le fond, tous les gens que je vois là, ce sont mes voisins. C'est ça le collectif. Qui sont mes voisins? Ceux de mon palier ou ceux de la ville?
No voy a traducirlo para que ustedes entendieran todo.
I'm not going to translate that because I'm sure you all understood it perfectly, but the name he referred to were the different buildings that were built during the 1960s and that were the aim or the target of the renovation project, where the client, in this case, it was him, and the operation was just to add some terrace space, without the inhabitants actually having to leave the houses at any point. So it was a very large-scale transformation with the tenants. They're not owners, they're tenants, without the tenants having to leave their homes. And in fact, that was possible. And with all the different, so we gave them 60 square meters more. Some of them use this space as a terrace, others use it as another room. And then again, with they didn't have to move out at all. They were able to continue living there at all times, which was a major achievement. I'm sure you already understood that, but just in case, there was a quick summary there. Now, there are a couple of issues there that I think could serve as a question for the other architects who are here. So the idea of the collective, and in fact, you won the first prize. So how have you worked on this concept? You're not just talking about the entrance, the stairway, the lift, the different common areas. What's your strategy? What's the response of residents? How do they see that with regard to these new lifestyles? Because obviously the classical idea of the nuclear family, which is at the heart of the classic European collective housing, no longer exists, or it's not so prevalent. So we're working in a very specific ecosystem in Barcelona with housing cooperatives. And La Borda, our project, didn't come from the administration. It was a grassroots movement. It was a movement to try to call for more public housing in Barcelona. And so it was a project based on activism. How can we activate the different districts, neighborhoods, and using what's already there? And with the case of La Borda, it's located in La Sants neighborhood, where there is the highest number of cooperatives in all Catalonia. There's a very strong association movement. So that was sort of the basis for this very powerful movement. They were saying, look, we don't want to leave our neighborhoods. We need to call for public housing, even though it's not being made, and we're just going to take matters into our own hands. And we came up with this kind of quite crazy plan. And for 2 years, it was just a group of people trying to imagine how we want to live. We didn't even have a plot, which really helped us to expand our reflections. We were thinking about, what does it mean to live somewhere? What can I have in my house? What can I have in community spaces? Where do community spaces finish? What are the filters that you go through when you go outside or you go from outside into your house? And we designed everything based on the common idea. And in fact, that was what La Borda ended up being. And at that moment, we we were very clear about this is how it had to be. Everybody starts getting very tense whenever we talk about housing, but you can't talk about housing without really having firm faith in community issues. So it was a long process. And when we started to think about La Borda, we were always thinking about it from a collective perspective. What is it that joins us? What is it that we want to share? What different needs does an older adult have in comparison to a child, for example, or families with young children? All of this was debated, and we were just imagining it. It was a pure exercise of imagination. And we were thinking about different types of architectures, maybe Asian architectures with a sort of a central hub, different types of architectures. And then when we had built trust in what we had in common, that's when we start talking about the private spaces, which is less important because we're talking about common spaces, we're talking about community. And that was the approach that we adopted. Lots of trial and error. And with a customer, a client who was actually demanding that we be as radical as possible. Fantastic client. So the project, as you said, was based on trial and error. So you just offered the community different alternatives and see how they reacted. And as it's not finished, can you still adjust along the way as you go along? So in that sense, we were lucky. I think that the most similar process would be that of a detached house. You have the architect working with the client, except that we didn't have just one person, we had 60 people. Because the people who were going to live in La Borda was a human group, and they were the ones behind the project. They were pushing the project forward. So you had your human group. So there's a lot of debate. And from there, you have to just slowly define each of the different issues that you're dealing with. But how can I say it? The architects, we basically said, look, we're here to help. We're helping the debate to move forward, to sort of to help these ideas materialize. But it's not just trial and error. It's a collective construction of the design. We spent a lot of time on that. If we had to pay it in monetary terms, there wouldn't be enough money in the world to pay for it, basically, because it's all based on activism, because it would have been impossible otherwise. But I have the feeling that it was designed, it was led by us, but it was built little by little by the users. And I think that we have achieved a very strong bond between the people who live now in La Borda with the building as well, because it was sort of self-constructed, if you like. They can think, well, I thought of this, I helped build this, I helped design this. And then with regard to the indeterminate nature of everything and how indeterminate it is, it's quite curious because the debates were really detailed. What's going to happen here? But then the architecture isn't very detailed, because what you debate one day, you got to wait for 2 years, and it has a different meaning. So it's all very well to get down to the nitty-gritty in the detail so that we can get an idea of what people want from those spaces, but then the space itself will be able to transform, and it will transform itself collectively, so that collectively you can generate new spaces all the time. So this whole idea of self-construction really exists. It's where the community continuously constructs its space. Pietro, English or Spanish?
It's not a problem.
English.
You can ask me in Spanish.
No,
I
I
will
can ask you.
probably answer in English.
So, getting the project by Vassal, this renovation of a block, it's conceptually not far from the project that was submitted by your office and was selected in the finalist. So I would be curious to know how you dealt with this element, which kind of affection do you have or you don't have with this kind of rather, what we think is a bland architecture, and instead which kind of values did you see in this kind of architecture, and through which operation you wanted to bring it back to a better quality of life for the dwellers?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Of course, the two projects are really close each other. I mean, we got a lot of point in common with the Lacaton and Mesa design, especially because we build up all the things with the inhabitants in the inside. So we have probably the same problem related to the building itself, because when you operate in a particular neighborhood, probably related to a very bad narrative like all the suburbs have, and that's another by the way, a huge question related to the collective housing, especially in Italy, because we have a lot of housing stock built in decades after Second World War, and then we forget it. And we, in the last 20 years, 30 years, we had a lot of steps back in terms of renovating and thinking about public housing. So the first action we had, our office together with another one, the Bombazaro one, it was to really think about the building as a heritage, as something that matters, not just for the building itself, but especially for the community which somehow recognize themselves into this building, into this neighborhood, which is, by the way, made by 14 concrete brutalist towers built on the hill of Trento town. So this first action of recognizing that there was a community really alive, by the way, was very important for acting as architects in terms of with a lot of respect for the building, for the history of this building, for the landmark that it represents for our community and for our territories and for our story. And so we think about the renovation of this building basically as a, how can I say, a restoration, the one you made in the Historical City Center, for example, just to maintain all the language, all the materials, all the aspects, and give to the people who lives there, which is basically low income residents, as much as possible to give a quality design, and that's another very important things that we learned from Lacaton and Vassal, that probably architecture, contemporary architecture, is something that should become less fancy, less for healthiest people, but something that can help people, like normal people, like lower income people, to to live better. Everybody should deserve a good building with the quality implants, with some isolation, and that was the basic idea we had. And yeah, it's really, we learn a lot about them.
and because you mentioned the existing stock of housing in Europe, that most of the circumstances is not well kept. What was can you tell us more about who decided to give the project to you and not to the usual construction company or cheap engineering company to do the minimal works to avoid the building to fall? What happened that made, because it's, as an Italian, I know it's not very usual what you did, which were the lucky coincidences that brought also, I think, the public administration, the agency that manages the building to decide to go into this direction, rather than either demolishing or doing the minimal, bad job?
We came into this design thanks to a competition, basically. That it's it's something that is not very common in Italy as well, to use competition for renovate or to build up something new. And the Public Housing Institute, who runs all this building, was somehow he had to do this competition basically because some of the funding that was used for renovate this building came from Europe, so was European funding. Thanks, by the way, that we have these wonderful things. It's really precious, I guess. So they had this competition. We, you know, catch together with some colleagues, and we basically proposed this design, which was, as I said, a bit radical in terms of attitude. All the entries, all the other entries, was really, you know, like muscular design with this, you know, huge energetical things that very, you know, physical. And probably we won thanks to this really light approach we had on the building. Of course, as you said, is not very common, not just for the competition itself, but in general in Italy, it's not very common to approach to the public housing heritage with, you know, with the mature approach, to face that it's something that matters for, as I said, for the communities, for our history. We had like 40 years of public housing legacy, like I said, especially after the Second World War till the 70s somehow, and then nothing more. And then we still have this kind of building, and in my personal opinion, this lack of interesting on the collective housing problem, which is connected obviously to the housing crisis we are facing in Italy right now, is that we probably we do not are able to make this shift from recognizing that all this neighborhood we built up in the 60s, in the 50s, in the 70s are something really beautiful. We love it. We love it so much that we open up a museum for, you know, for this kind of building. We go on all around the building to, you know, talk to the people that their housing matters and are really cool, and the architects are cool. And this is the problem. We are stuck in this recognition that all this housing matters, and if we can able to do this shift, probably we can put some funding more, and, you know, establish like a mechanism in which, you know, we can redevelop, renovate all these things that is not just building, but especially we can, together with the building, you can renovate the community. You can help community to, you know, love better the place in which they live. They can recognize that the community as someone who lives in this building is something that it's truly important for, you know, for the building, for you know, for working better together. So but that's a lot of work to do, by the way.
Thank you very much for that answer, which really reminds me of a lot of the conversations that we had in the scientific committee right at the beginning, when we were talking about what categories needed to be created, whether we had to divide between public development, private development. I remember we had some really complex sessions about if we had to divide it up regarding, you know, the price per square meter of the different projects. And I think that very wisely the committee said, look, let's just forget this categories. We're going to have two categories, and then the jury can decide whether or not they like the sort of the private, more luxury type of development or another type of development. And there were two categories: new builds and renovations. And in fact, that's why you're here, right? You were finalists in that category. And I think the committee was very, very clear about where we needed to go. Because it could have been renovations, not just housing, there could be offices as well. And in fact, the winner was an old wine store that was renovated there. And I wanted to ask you, do you agree with what Pietro has just been saying? Because obviously this is very much linked to the political side of things. I know I worked in, I know in Bordeaux we know that a lot of politicians don't want any new bills, they want to renovate. I mean, what do you think of all of this? I think that one thing that you just said is very interesting, and I hadn't realized it before. Thinking about your towers, because I have seen them. I haven't seen them in situ, but I have seen photos. They're very powerful because you're on a very flat plain, very flat landscape. And then all of a sudden you see these 3 huge towers. They're really imposing. And from the outside, you think, right, well, to protect the landscape, perhaps we should have just demolished them. And if you're going to renew them, maybe you should have disguised them so that they didn't look so much like 1960s tower blocks, which is what they are. And then you say, yeah, but the memory of the local people have identified them emotionally, perhaps not rationally, but definitely emotionally, because they don't fit really into the canons of beauty, but they are there. They have an emotional resonance. And if you change that image that exists in people's memories, then you're going to do something wrong. And I think that's a really insightful comment. There are people who've seen these towers all their lives. They might even think that they're ugly. They might continue to think that they're ugly, but they're their towers. They may be ugly towers, but they're their towers. So this work of saying, okay, I'm going to improve it, but I'm going to respect that image, and I'm just going to use, or put the minimum, do the minimum changes, but I'm going to make sure that those changes are very high quality, which is what as far as I can see, you've done, to do the minimum, but make sure it's really well done. Now, I think that's a different way. It's quite a novel way of looking at restoration, because often people think that renovation means just to put something over the top. And if you can put more layers on top of the existing building so that it looks new, well, so much the better. Before it was just, cleaning the stone, but now you have to sort of put on another layer, put a corset on the building, if you like. And I think that the lightness that you were talking about is, I think, something that we could add to the program of what is renovation, of what is understood as the renovation of the housing stock. It's not just a case of building on top of everything. We have to maintain and respect the memory of what already exists, because we might think it's awful, very ugly, or we've thought it's ugly for years, and all of a sudden we can find beauty in them once again.
Je crois que c'est vraiment là où il faut qu'on se dirige avec beaucoup plus d'énergie et de force.
Oui, on s'est accordé assez rapidement sur le fait qu'il fallait prendre les 2 catégories, puisque, comme tu le disais, les politiques en particulier se focalisent sur la production neuve. Et pour l'instant, on voit peu d'élus couper des cordons d'une réhabilitation. C'est beaucoup plus rare. Mais on sait que l'avenir est dans la reprise de l'existant. Et si on regarde, même pour la production du nombre de logements dont on a besoin aujourd'hui, la production neuve en France, alors en Espagne, je ne sais pas quel pourcentage ça représente, mais par rapport au parc existant, c'est 1% d'augmentation par an. Or, on en construit des milliers en France, de logements neufs. Donc, ça pèse que dalle. Donc, il n'y a plus d'enjeu là-dessus. Et si on s'intéresse au plan écologique, puisqu'on a beaucoup aussi discuté on voulait des critères écologiques dans le neuf et dans la réhabilitation. Si on regarde la question écologique dans le neuf, il n'y en a pas, puisque le bilan carbone de 1% de production neuve, vous ne le voyez pas. Ça pèse que dalle, ça ne changera rien. Donc, il n'y a plus aucun, de mon point de vue, il n'y a plus aucun enjeu sur le neuf. Donc, on va continuer d'en faire, mais à mon avis, ce n'est pas un objet scientifique intéressant aujourd'hui. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est la réhabilitation, la transformation. Par exemple, on a une vraie question des milliers de mètres carrés de bureaux qu'on a fabriqués pendant des décennies, parce que le bureau, et je pense qu'en Espagne, c'est un peu aussi comme en France, Moi, ça m'a toujours étonné. Moi, je suis plutôt dans le logement, mais je me suis aussi beaucoup intéressé à la question de la production du bureau. Et on voit, à Bordeaux par exemple, ou dans les grandes villes, produire bon an mal an des milliers de mètres carrés vides. On se dit, mais quel est le modèle économique derrière des bâtiments qui ne trouveront pas de locataires? En fait, il y a un modèle économique qui tourne à côté du marché, qui fait qu'il y a une rentabilité d'investissement sur le mètre carré de bureau. Et moi, je me dis, ces mètres carrés qui sont inoccupés, il va bien falloir s'en occuper, et c'est vraiment extrêmement passionnant quoi, de reconvertir des bureaux, et je trouve que c'est beaucoup plus passionnant de faire le travail qu'ils ont fait que de faire du neuf, quoi, parce que ça demande beaucoup plus de savoir-faire, et comme tu l'évoques, effectivement, ça demande aussi une attention à l'histoire. Ça demande une attention à qui a vécu là, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé. Donc on va embarquer aussi une autre dimension humaine qu'on embarque très peu dans le neuf, sauf si on fait du participatif. Mais si on fait du neuf traditionnel, on n'embarque rien, ni de l'histoire, ni de l'humain. C'est du vide, quoi. Alors que dans l'existant, enfin, le travail qu'ils ont fait de réhabilitation, on voit bien l'attention qu'ils ont portée à l'architecte qui a produit l'œuvre avant. Et donc, avec la réhabilitation, ce que je trouve passionnant, et les archives adorent ça, hein, mais c'est quoi la filiation? En fait, qu'est-ce que je me transmets d'archi en archi et qu'est-ce qui va se fabriquer comme patrimoine humain dans ces nombreuses modifications qui vont intervenir? Donc je pense qu'il y a une patte beaucoup plus intéressante. Et moi, je pense que le prix devrait être plus attentif encore demain pour le numéro 2, hein, à effectivement la question de la transformation de l'existant. Pour nos sociétés, on l'avait exprimé ici déjà l'année dernière, hein, je crois, l'enjeu, il est là, hein, il n'est pas dans le neuf. Sauf dans les démarches où on intègre les habitants dans la production de leur habitat. Là, il y a vraiment quelque chose d'extrêmement passionnant qui se passe. Hein. Mais le neuf du promoteur, à part fabriquer de la marchandise qui a une valeur sur un marché immobilier, je ne vois pas ce qui est intéressant. Hein.
And in local, you have to take into account environmental issues as well. You understood that demolition was much more damaging to the environment than renovation was. So how did you work on all of those issues in your projects? Well, we generally work in the field of cooperative housing. We're not having a lot of opportunity to renovate. We have 2 projects at the moment with 20 dwellings each that are being renovated, but that comes from the private sphere, people who buy buildings. And they don't make a lot of profit from it because it's the model is very different. They could earn a lot more money using a different model, but they choose this model. But it's necessary. It is nevertheless the private sphere. But La Borda should have been the renovation of some industrial premises, which were located nearby. We were really trying to get hold of that building. That was when we got the definitive no, we thought, right, okay, well, we'll just have to build a new building. Obviously, as sustainably as possible with minimum emissions. We used timber, understanding a building as a refuge for energy poverty. It doesn't matter. You need to guarantee comfort at €0 cost. There are some, it is more difficult to do that, especially if you're renovating. If you can put some galleries in, that's great. But that type of building doesn't really exist in Barcelona, where we have very narrow streets, there's not a lot of light, so it makes things a bit more difficult in Barcelona. So what we usually do in that city is to work on the thermal insulation. Obviously more difficult the lower down you get. And as we have people who live in the group at a higher level, if you like, then we started with collective systems of collection and distribution of piping throughout the building. So it's not just the person who's lucky enough to be up on the 5th floor and it just gets all the sunlight and nobody else gets any. No, it has to be distributed. In La Borda, on the southern side of things, we have, of the 28 apartments, 24 are south facing and they hardly need anything at all. And the 4 that face the north, the costs for heating is shared between the entire community. So you can do that. You can have centralized installations. You distribute the gains between all the residents. And users are important, of course. Users need to understand how to manage the building. So you need to design, knowing that you're talking about people who are very aware of all of this. They know how it should work. Obviously, if one person doesn't do things properly, it doesn't all collapse, but kind of more or less. So all the different dwellings are monitored, and sometimes you have to say, hey, look, you've not putting your blinds down in summer. Come on, pull your socks up. But you look at the building as one collective unit that functions at the same time. So it's everybody's obligation to look after their dwellings because it has an effect on everyone. And just a question. I remember I was teaching at university, and there was a book I was reading. And it was the book by De Rossi. And as a communist, he said, of course, that private property is the enemy of the future development of the city. This was way back last century sometime. But the conclusion, which is a fairly bitter conclusion, is that unless we profoundly question the political system and the social system, it doesn't matter how many architects are going to be working on this, then the future looks bleak. So I'd like to know how you see the political responses to everything that you do. So the ability to see beyond the quality of the architectural project. Can we go a bit further? Can we, I don't know, play around with the decisions, the political decisions made? Now, I know that in Spain at the time there was a lot of protests out on the street calling for collective housing and public housing, but if perhaps we can just take off our architect hats off for a moment and just have a look at how we see the political situation. Is the situation positive? Is what De Rossi says going to come true? Or is there something that we can do about it? Is it a trans-European tendency towards this, or is it just more sort of, there are a lot of differences between different countries? Any of you can answer that. Well, I always think that in moments of tension, that's when good things tend to crop up. Going back to what I know best, which was the process of La Borda, there was a social outbreak, there was social uprising there. It was built in 2018, but the idea was born in 2011. There was a lot of political changes in Catalonia at that time. People didn't know what they wanted something new, and this generates change. It's, again, trial and error. And I think that now we're in a moment in which people are, we're seeing another moment like that. But there's a lot more fear around at the moment, fear of new ideas. And there's not a lot of hope about the future. And it's much easier to think about dystopias than utopias. We need to start thinking about utopias again. And it requires an effort because the reality is very complex at the moment and it's fairly negative. We have climate change, we have political problems, we have all sorts of problems. So where will these utopias come from? I don't know. But I think that tension is good for creating something new. I think that's very clear. And then sometimes when people think about housing crisis, we need to build loads of houses. I feel a bit sad. It just makes me sad, because it's not a numerical issue. It's an issue of quality and how. And in the process, you can achieve so much more than in the actual end result. It's not just a case of building this many houses to house this many people. The process in and of itself is important. And if you waste that opportunity, you waste a lot of things. A lot of things fall by the wayside, and it's not transformative. So here, often people talk a lot about transformation. But architecture isn't transformational. People transform things. People change things. So if you, in the process, you don't transform the users, you don't transform society so that they look at these buildings with new eyes, then architecture isn't transformative. You can have co-housing of rich people, and it can look like one of our co-housings, but it's not the same. So what's transformational? It's not architecture. I mean, it helps, obviously. It's an infrastructure that accompanies this, but it's not the actual transformational force. There are people clapping already. I can hear. Bernard.
Par rapport à la transformation de la ville, effectivement, quelles sont les réponses du politique, de l'économique par rapport à des questions où l'architecture opère, mais finalement avec un rôle assez réduit. Et je citais le dernier chapitre du livre d'Aldor aussi qui disait que finalement le grand ennemi du développement urbain futur, c'est la propriété privée. Et où nous en sommes 50 ans plus tard par rapport à ce type de réflexion. Et quel est ton jugement, effectivement, où vont les tendances politiques actuelles?
Oui, il avait aussi raison. Mais en même temps, il s'arrête un peu tôt, quoi. L'ennemi de la ville, c'est le capitalisme, c'est pas la propriété privée. Donc il faut taper un cran au-dessus. Et donc, ce que l'on a à affronter aujourd'hui, c'est ce mouvement, ce capitalisme qui va tout transformer en marchandise. Le logement est passé dans cette moulinette à partir de la reconstruction, parce qu'il fallait aller vite, il fallait loger des millions de personnes qui étaient à la rue. Et d'un seul coup, il s'est saisi de cette marchandise-là, enfin, il a fait du logement une marchandise, donc ça, c'est le drame de notre moment historique. Et tant qu'on sera dans ce système économique-là, on n'y échappera pas. On va rester dans la production de biens manufacturés qui a une valeur sur le marché, une valeur d'échange, etc. Donc ça, si je ne change pas le modèle économique, à mon avis, les meilleurs architectes du monde demain, dans un monde utopique, ils tournent à vide, quoi. Ils ne feront rien de plus. Et donc, il faut... Moi, je pense que le seul espoir qu'on puisse garder, si on n'a pas envie de se payer le modèle économique au-dessus et affronter le capitalisme, eh ben, il faut se rabattre sur les habitants. Et on voit que, quelles que soient les conditions qu'on leur donne pour habiter, ils habitent bien. Ils habitent, ils sauvent leur peau, ils transforment l'intérieur du logement. Regardez par exemple, le travail que font Anne et Jean-Philippe sur les grandes barres, c'est ils font venir un photographe qui va photographier tous les intérieurs. Donc on a 500 photos prises au même endroit dans les séjours des 530 logements du GHI, avant travaux. Et bien vous avez 530 mondes habités. Et alors vous allez du Maroc à l'Afrique subsaharienne, vous partez au Pérou. Chacun, pourtant c'est la même cage à lapin d'origine. C'est la même uniformité, c'est les mêmes conditions capitalistes d'habiter dans lesquelles on les a contraints de venir. Et ils nous fabriquent un monde. Donc moi je pense que l'espoir, il est à mettre dans l'attention qu'on porte à l'habitant. Il est là, dans l'existant, pour le transformer, et puis demain, pour se réapproprier le neuf, quoi. Enfin, quand vous arrivez dans un logement neuf, la première chose que vous avez envie de faire, c'est faire tomber des cloisons, quoi. C'est de recomposer l'intérieur. Alors quand vous êtes locataire, c'est compliqué. Parce qu'on vous interdit même de refaire les peintures des murs. Donc voilà les conditions que le capitalisme nous offre. Et malgré ça, on arrive à créer notre monde dans ces conditions-là. Donc rapprochons-nous des habitants. Le monde merveilleux de l'habiter, il est là. Il n'est pas du côté des architectes. Désolé pour vous.
Aurora, Pietro, okay.
Yeah, I have an example about these things of the public and private property. The tower itself, during the 80s, 90s, for a political consensus reason, the public institution who run the buildings decided to sell a couple of buildings to some inhabitants. And that, I don't know, that they thought that probably this was a good idea, but the side effect you had that is they fragmented the properties, and so this stuck like every maintenance that you can have on the buildings, because I don't know, like 30, 40, 50% was public, and then you have 50% private. So the private one do not want to spend too much, because probably, and obviously the building, the public housing building are huge building with a lot of maintenance problem. And then they sold this with a funding from the outside, like I said, from Europe. But after this, they spent like 20 years without any maintenance, so the building itself was really like collapsing. And so it's kind of plastic example of especially on the collective housing, of the problem of mixing up private and public. You should maintain it public, but obviously. And another thing I was thinking about, especially related to your example, which I think that could be an answer to all the architects, or at least we are, it's our concern that probably we go on in the ages thinking about solving things with buildings, like with hardware things, you know? And the example of La Borda represent the idea that it's not the hardware that probably solve the things, but it's the software that goes together with it. So I guess that probably the huge and the most important message that we can give to the collective housing is to merge together this idea of hardware and software, that you build up something, but you have to build up a community that you know, care about the things that you build, probably, and that's why and this goes together with the property, because if you care something, you probably are not so concerned about possessing something. You know, it's not a problem that is yours. It's your little community that goes on and, you know, maintain the things, get together, and that's why I guess and in Italy, going back to our, you know, sad country, but doesn't have any legislation that helps this kind of process, and that's why this award, all this, it's truly important. Maybe it's one of the most important things that we can say on architecture right now about, you know, the housing, about this issue. So, you know, thank you.
So come on, the last word. You've got a last word for you. I'm not going to, just to finish, I'm not going to talk about housing. I'm going to talk about what I think is happening. And that is that we all want to live in large cities. And that's generating a lot of problems. It happened with the Industrial Revolution as well. As long, in Spain, we all want to live in about 5 or 6 cities. Anywhere else in Spain, there's no problems with housing. It's only in these cities because we all want to live there. But so spatial planning and infrastructures that we need, I don't know if perhaps we need to have that so that we can all live in places with fewer inhabitants to avoid the housing crisis. I mean, it's not a generalized housing crisis. We can go to Cáceres, we can go to Valencia, there's no housing crisis there, but nobody wants to go and live there. And I think that's what's at the heart of the crisis, which we're all terribly worried about, and it seems to affect all of us, but actually only affects, in Spain, at least 1/3 of the population. The rest of them don't have problems with prices or housing. It's not a problem for everybody else. So I think we have to focus more on spatial planning and not just on the housing stock. Well, I think this has been a perfect European exercise. We've had 2 Italians, we've had a French person, we've had a Spanish person. We could have spoken Catalonian. We have had a bit of Basque as well. I think this is a wonderful example of European, Europe, which has, according to Trump, been created to annoy the Americans, which I think would be an issue for a whole nother debate. But we can finish this wonderfully European movement by going up and having a look at the exhibition that's upstairs. But I think, first of all, a warm round of applause for all our guests, please. Well, just a couple of, I was going to say, instructions, because there's actually quite a lot of us here, and we won't be able to explain all of this to all of you. But sorry, I was just moving over here because there's interference over there. But the exhibition covers 2 rooms. In one of the rooms, we have the finalists. We wanted to move away from the classic format of panel photo, and to just trust that, well, all the documents will appear in a catalogue which we will be publishing for the exhibition in Bordeaux. And we've organised all our material around 8 concepts, and around those 8 concepts we have different photos, different documents, which enable, I think, quite an interesting cross-cutting sort of atlas type approach. And in the other room we have the winners, the winning projects. We have the new build, which was La Colle, and the Zinsel in Basilea, the renovation of that large industrial building. And then we also have the other 2 projects. We have the one from Sheffield and the Duncan Lewis in Bordeaux. Thank you very much for coming. And there's also a video you can see. It's very interesting, by Miquel Blasco, of a video inside the buildings. It's perhaps a bit long, I don't know. I think maybe you have to have a couple of glasses of wine, not just one glass of wine, because it lasts for about 20 minutes, so it might be a bit long. But I think it gives you a much better idea of what the dwellings look like from inside, and it's very realistic, so that's good. So thank you all very much. The wine will be served downstairs in the cloister, so do feel free to be upstairs or downstairs, whichever you prefer. Thank you all very much indeed.